an original.
From Story Studio Network.
Well, here we are. It's Wednesday, the 26th day of July. And as we record this episode of Now and Next for Story Studio Network, I'm watching the parade of those who will be sitting in the cabinet seats in Ottawa. Probably in the next hour or so, they'll be sworn in and that'll all be done but the crying. And I guess unofficially we're into election mode in Ottawa with the new cabinet in place, the new face of the federal government, etc. So all kinds of fun to watch. Be interesting to see, though. There's some reporting, Anand is moving out of defense, Bill Blair moving into the defense. That's kind of interesting. But there are a lot of new faces, rookies here who are walking up the driveway at Rideau Hall. So more of a shakeup than a shuffle, it sounds like. So we'll watch that with interest and see how that plays out. Welcome in. It is Now and Next. I'm Dave Trafford for Story Studio Network. And yesterday we had a rather spirited discussion with Laura Babcock out of Hamilton. And she has been sort of a dog on the bone when it comes to the performance of Andrea Horwath as the new mayor of Hamilton. And she and I got into the conversation that, in fact, there was an opportunity for the mayor of Hamilton and the mayor of Toronto to sort of join forces and push the federal government to make sure that it's doing the right thing by municipalities in this country. And certainly it came to a head last week when we had the refugee crisis on the streets of Toronto and the feds finally coughed up $97 million that they already owed us here in the city. We have 23 Liberals in this city representing the federal government. Not one of them stepping up or stepping out to say, Toronto deserves better, but we'll wait to see. But I think Laura's point was we need action right now on so many levels, whether it's on housing, whether it's on homelessness, or whether it's on poverty. Those are sort of the three pillars that we really should be paying attention and making a priority in terms of policy. So we are engaged in a conversation, and we're about to release a series with our friends at Daily Bread Food Bank on the 2030 project. And we're looking at a number of issues, not the least of which is the newly minted Canadian Disability Benefit Act that was made law at the end of June, just before the feds rose for the summer. So we wanted to get some perspective on that, probably take a look at the pulse in terms of what the political outlook looks like in terms of getting some of these things tackled. So pleased to welcome in Gerard Kennedy, and Gerard and I probably crossed paths, I want to say, mid-'80s, late 80s. He was the new guy at the Daily Bread Food Bank. I was the new guy at Q107, so we were trying to figure out what is this food bank thing and how temporary is it. So he has some history in some of the conversations that we have been having. Welcome. It's good to see you.
Nice to see you, too.
Doesn't feel like that long ago, but when you look at it, you figure, wow, this is the food bank has become something that was grassroots, community driven, and I don't say that to disparage it. Obviously, now it's the number of visits to the food bank become a key economic indicator. It's become a critical part of supporting our economy in some respects.
Well, I guess that's true. I think it has to be kept in perspective that the community effort can't match an entitlement. If our citizenship means something, if we have a commonality because we're in Canada, it can't be different for a group of people. It can't be done on the side. It can't be depending on whether somebody wakes up in the morning or whether somebody decides to care today. And that's always been the intended shortcoming of food banks. And so it may look a little slicker, but it's still really organized goodwill. And yes, hunger's a quiet noise. You don't hear it. You don't even know about it unless you make it your business. But it can't be the preserve of a few people. And I think we've slipped back a little bit and I understand there's been a pandemic, there's been fear, there's been uncertainty. And those are never good times for people who are in a consistent struggle. And we've seen some of this before. We've been through a few cycles, unfortunately, in the ups and downs of food banks. But I think people need to keep in mind, food banks managed to get everyone involved at one point. Like, not food banks by themselves, but we got a child benefit. We got other things happening that actually reduce the demand for food banks. And so, yes, I think people have gotten used to food banks, but I don't think they should feel that there's either something that's taken care of and they don't have to worry about it, or that it's been one march to us not being plugged in. I think there's a disconnect right now. The open question, can it get fixed? Will people care again? Will food banks be left trying to look after people? Because that equation, food banks plus need, is never a resolution. People spending any time visiting food banks are people interrupted on their journey to be part of Canada, to be able to contribute. If they have to scramble to feed their kids, if their own health and well-being is at risk. We heard a very concerning report about the correlation between mental health and people's well-being when you're on the edge like that. It doesn't take a lot of imagination for the rest of us who haven't experienced this to know where that's going to lead. Trouble for them, higher costs for us. When the food bank noise gets louder, it's time to pay attention, and hope. And that's the test: is will people? How many times has that bell been rung, and will people pay attention? I think that's what's definitely on the bubble right now. Is that going to happen again?
Well, you got, and as you say that, and I kind of go back to the heart of the pandemic, and it was obviously a crisis, and the folks at the food bank were quite literally at some point, considering lockdowns and everything else, having to camp out at their facilities to make sure that things kept going and out the door and in the door and so on. So the level of crisis was only escalated and amplified. But at the same time, governments across the country, particularly the federal government, was dishing out loads of money to support the food bank. And at the time, I thought, that's great, except all it's doing is creating a bigger Band-Aid in some respects. That, in fact, the success, and I put that in air quotes, of the food banks gives political cover to the federal government, the provincial governments, the municipal governments across the country, don't they?
Well, I think that part of the effort, I think there were a lot of good things that happened during the pandemic from the standpoint of not letting people fall down. Money into food banks is always an issue. I mean, if we think about the food banks in Canada, they've been disciplined to not be part of a social welfare system by being independent, by not having government dollars, even in many cases, big foundation dollars. They've been really drawing from small donors, food donations, and surplus food. People, I think, don't have any reason to know or remember, but that's been the bulk of the supply, is food that the rest of us maybe find a little less attractive, or we didn't buy it on time, or it's packaged the wrong way, so it's at the food bank. It's still nutritious, and that's how the food banks have been able to stand up the kind of response that they've been able to do. Changing that formula puts us on track for problems. And so that was a jarring part of the response. I understand, because I happen to get invoked by a few people that wanted to know, and I think they were reluctant, and I think they put in some safeguards, because that can't be an ongoing way for any level of government to say, this is how we're going to make citizenship work. A different, inferior food supply system, no matter how well-intentioned, no matter how fueled by concern and angst and empathy for other people, that shouldn't be official. And so I think that's another thing that's on the bubble. Will food banks be able to operate at a high level of need and avoid becoming drawn in? Because food banks have always ever only been ahead on points. If they're free to advocate, to tell us what that situation is, to look at who's coming in the door and represent them, if they close that door, if it's not a window, if it's not a real frank look at what's going on, doesn't matter who's in power or what they think they're doing, then food banks start to be potentially part of the problem. But that's not really the issue here. When food banks are in everyday demand, I think that the pandemic, that could be a mulligan for everybody on a whole bunch of fronts. I was, doing COVID testing in charge of a medical lab. I mean, there's a lot of people doing a lot of things, but coming out of it is it's seemingly now monthly character test. How are we going to do? Who demands our first attentions? And it may not be intuitive for everyone, but I've learned that if we're paying attention to our seniors, to people who are vulnerable, to people who've lost a job, who've become disabled, who, family breakdown is something that they're trying to get a handle on. If we can pay attention there, we can grow together as a society. If we can't find the room, then we start to be a different place. And so hopefully some of these tough questions, the government funding, what is going to happen next in terms of our priorities as we try and put things back together, it's not going to leave people behind because, there's a Canadian sensibility. People think, well, we're nicer people. We say, excuse me, we're sorry. We're not rough and tough and running people over in our society setup. But that's something that was earned by our parents and our grandparents. How are we doing this generation is right here in front of us.
Well, and as you talk about that, and the more sophisticated view of what the food banks are doing, et cetera, and I know that they, whether it's Daily Bread or Feed Ontario or Food Banks Canada, they have their research departments now, and they're looking at drilling down on how many are showing up on a monthly basis. Neil Hetherington keeps coming back to that number, the big number recently, 270,000 visits a month here in Toronto alone. Mm-hmm. It's staggering. And I realize, they did some really interesting research with the folks out at Calgary, in the University of Calgary, talking about the direct link between food bank visits and government policy and the effect that one has on the other. And if you raised minimum wage, so for example, food bank visits come down. If you lowered rents, food bank visits come down. So there's this obvious thing, but the research is evidence based and it's right there. And I'm fascinated by that. But at what point are they out of their lane there? At what point should we be relying on these not-for-profit, community-based groups to be doing that kind of research just to get attention from government?
Well, listen, we did it from day one. Again, it's what made food banks a little bit different. I was there at the first food bank in the country in Edmonton in 1983, and oil prices had dropped, and so there was an advanced recession going on in Alberta. And, the board, we looked at things, we said, something's gone wrong here. We're getting run over. And we better let the government know something went wrong with their welfare programs. The government wrote back and said, how much money you want for a van for your operation? And to their credit, the board said, no, we want you to answer the question. Mm-hmm. What part of this is your responsibility? And we got in a study with them to look at, confidentially, the overlaps and so on. And by 1984, in fact, the study was done, and they pulled out. And instead what they did is they unilaterally raised welfare rates. They fixed the problem that they created to an extent. So there's always been, from the very first food bank and the very first meeting of the predecessor to Food Banks Canada, the Canadian Association of Food Banks, which I helped to organize, there's always been, and it crosses a spectrum, ideologically, whatever. We've got all kinds of religious groups, all kinds of community groups involved. But when people of goodwill get a chance to look at this, they realize that there's two privileges there. One, you get to sit on which side of the table when people walk in the door. And the other one, when you know something, you better be saying something about it. So I would actually say that part is the redeeming part of food banks. Now, how sophisticated should they have to be? Should the government by this time have their own early warning system? Should they know what's happening? That's a very good point. But I do think that that's a legitimate role for the community to help people at a time in their lives when it looks like they're sort of lost in what else is going on out there, and give it some life. I'm not sure the number is what matters as much as the contact, but still making it make sense. Putting a claim in on their behalf if you're working with them. If you're not just saying, oh, those poor people. If you're saying, these people, look at them struggle. Look at the dignity they have. Look at the other things they're doing to feed their kids, to make them grow up with the same values our parents instilled in us. and yet they've got so little to work with. They're making sacrifices. Look at those food bank numbers. Imagine, people going without food to put sandwiches in their kids' lunch. It's not hard to imagine hunger. We all reach for the fridge or the cupboard. But in our case, there's something there. What if there wasn't? That's what's going on at food banks. And so it's, those people are working a lot harder to keep that social gravity, to stay connected than the rest of us, because they can't take it for granted. And the only thing, unfortunately, is that we don't have a luxury here of just talking about it. The longer it goes on, the more difficult life is for those people, for their kids, for their prospects, because that kind of struggle in the midst of so much plenty, it particularly takes a toll. And I was very struck again by that recent report about the mental health of children, because they know the milieu they're in. It's instinctual, and that they're being sort of put out of the mainstream, that they can't participate, that they can't go places. We got tear-ups on everything. You can't even visit somebody in the hospital without paying a price that the rest of us grumble about. But if you're parking your car, at least you're paying, I think it was $35 to see a friend in the hospital yesterday. And we don't realize that all over the place, particularly in places like Toronto, but even in other places across the country, we're barring people from participating in society if they don't have very much to live on.
Yeah, you've sat in the chair at the food bank, then you've sat around the cabinet table here in Ontario. We shouldn't still be having this conversation. I mean, where's the political disconnect here that is so bloody tone deaf?
Well, it's, I don't think there's any point in pointing fingers. The food bank demand came down. The child benefit helped immensely. Adjustments to provincial welfare programs made a big difference. The economy and jobs make a difference. Support for people, but I remember at one point we had refugees not given work permits, and suddenly we had tens of thousands of people. Well, where are we at recently? Some kind of battle. I'm trying to parse it, but why would there be people having to live outside? And why would there, again, have to be, private churches giving them a place in their basement because governments can't agree who's got so much money? I mean, we want them, the people that do that job full time of minding, our programs and our sensibilities, to get those kind of things solved. So that's what's recurring here. And if there's anything about, I wouldn't, we can't afford to be despairing this, but progress was made. Food bank demand was brought down. There was, responsiveness. And the question of how do we make that more real, because for people's lives, the pandemic has been tamped down for a while now. Why hasn't there been a closer look at what the implications are? And this tremendous demand in Toronto, which, yes, has exceeded even the worst that we had in the middle of recessions in 1990, and by 95, there were housing costs that started to rise and so on. And we had, for a while there, it looked like Daily Bread was just approaching those numbers, but they've now gone, in the Toronto area, Daily Bread and the other services here have gone beyond that. And we really should be worried about that. Ostensibly, people are working, but you look at Daily Bread's numbers, and there are some people that are working and not doing all right. So, no, we haven't got that message. It is concerning, but I think it is, again, it's like a test. Can people care? Can they plug in? People that think they live in a city or a community or a neighborhood that is starting to concern them, do they retreat, or do they start asking these questions themselves? Because that was the other power of the food bank. We did big food drives when we got people engaged and involved, and people writing petitions on the side of the bags and so on. I mean, when the food banks show up, do they have tens of thousands or hundreds of thousands of concerned average people on their shoulder? That's what gets people organized. Yes, we want to wait to get this taken care of, and maybe that's the next step for food banks, is to not worry as much about what they're doing, but to get the government to take over even some of those other functions. But right now, unfortunately, we're back in that familiar position. What can government do to make lives better for people? How do we not make just, the things that happen in life? If family breaks down, if someone becomes too ill or sick or disabled, if someone loses their job, or this newest phenomenon seems to be, we've got jobs out there that pay so poorly, that are part-time, or the wages are so low, they just can't allow people enough to get by. That's pretty scary. They're doing exactly what people on, if you picked a range of the spectrum of the political side of things, people say, oh, they should be working. Well, they are. They're out there and working, and it's not working for them. That's not sustainable. And so it's, it really, comes down to, mobilizing some of the people that use food banks that might be in a position to speak up, but also the rest of us. It always does. And I've always been impressed, I guess you could say, that if we present it the right way, if governments want to tap into that, if food banks start to focus that there is goodwill in Canadian society that is genuine and deep-seated, and maybe it's because of the experience of our parents and grandparents, or whether it's in this country or as people came here from elsewhere, we know what it's like somewhere in our psyche to be hard scrabble and not be able to just depend that cupboard and that fridge yields up what we need. So that's what we're going to have to depend on and put it to a test. And it's my hope that edge is there with the food banks, even if they're kind of exhausted, just doing their daily thing. And I've been visiting food banks, and I see that they're getting exhausted, and they're shaking their head, and they're wondering, when is the cavalry coming? I mean, that's the problem, is they really are now looking for some relief. And they need all of us to find a way to help amplify not just this problem, it's everybody's problem, but this character test for Canada. Are we really different? Do we really have that deep-seated concern? Is that part of our day-to-day? Or do we think someone else is going to take care of it? Or are we going to harden up and not let this be part of how we live?
So part of that is our own societal response to it, our sense of responsibility, well-being of others, taking care of each other, and that's an important part of it. I think you're right in terms of understanding the history of it. My grandparents would have been shocked at the amount of waste there is in this world right now. But at the same time, and you've pointed to government action that has made the difference. It has helped bring children out of poverty. It has helped bring seniors out of poverty. So where does the Canada Disability Act fall for you? Is that just barely a bugle call from the cavalry, or is there any hope and that this is going to actually take another step forward? It's certainly not the complete answer, but so many people who live in poverty are living that with disability.
Well, I think it has some good attributes in that it's sort of like the advanced scouts for the cavalry. I don't think we want to. That analogy is the best, and I have having raised it, but it's an income security thing, and for people out there that don't know, the disability benefit is saying, you know what, we know you agree. If you were, in a position where your physical or your mental well-being didn't allow you to participate, we think you agree that somebody should be making it possible for you to live with dignity. And it's kind of crazy that people probably believe that's taken care of already. I think that's why this exists, but it doesn't, because there's a mishmash of different programs, and none of them are tied to actual costs. So the fact that the Canada Disability Benefit is now possible, a law has been passed, but as a former lawmaker, nothing happens the day after a law is passed. There's a quiet on the land. There's no discernible effect. And so in this case, it's certainly about there being dollars, but there's also about the fact that this law is just a framework. It's a sketch pad. And what's going to go on that sketch pad is going to frankly depend on a lot more people appreciating what this could do. That this could actually take the people that we're pretty much all agree that if you had a workplace injury, or if you've got long COVID, or if some harm has happened to you, we don't want to see you in a food bank lineup or scrambling for food or going without. We believe in healthcare. We know that the healthcare system is probably serving people that have a disability to a greater extent, and we know it's just smart that the last reason people should need more healthcare would be they're not getting enough to eat or keep a roof over their head. So the disability benefit is meant to plug gaps, just like, we've got a thing happening in childcare that is frankly starting to look pretty impressive. We have a child benefit, and that reflects catching up to a social consensus. We don't want kids to go without. You take food away from kids, the nutritional food, and you pay that cost for the rest of their lives, unfortunately, if it happens for long enough. And so hopefully the disability benefit is going to capture us. But I think right now, unfortunately, most people aren't aware of it. The government has provided just a sketch pad, not a filled in, detailed expression. They didn't take that risk, unfortunately, of saying, we believe this, what do you think? This is what people should have to live on. This is how this should work. And it's been a conversation, I think, just among the representatives of a variety of groups and so on. And it's been a convivial conversation, but it now has to really touch other people. And I'm not sure who the minister is after today, but whether it's Minister Qualtrough or the Minister for Income Security, I guess we won't mention names because we don't know who's where. But I know they're interested. I know they're trying to tuck into that. But I think food banks and people interested in food banks and people interested in that there are people lining up, and that's what's happening again. We've got lineups outside. People have sort of changed that food bank experience. They let people pick food. They let people have some small choices there. Not as hard to interview them and make them feel that they don't belong and so on. But we're back to where there's only so much food to go around. People are lined up. Like I'm waving in the direction of a church 3 blocks from here, right? And 10 o'clock that they're going to open their doors, and they're going to be people lined up. And they're all going to get something, but what they're getting is less and less.
Yeah.
And so while we're talking, people are going without. And so the disability benefit has got to become someone's push. I put a really strong onus on the Liberal government. They've got to take some risk with this. If you believe in it, start talking about it, start telling people what you're going to do, how you're going to spend money on this and not on something else, because that's what political leadership is. And they need to do that.
So, and one of the struggles, just before we go and just kind of get at this, is that the definition of disability becomes a point of contention in some conversations. And as I listen to you and I listen to others talk about it, I said one of the things that we're missing in there is to qualify poverty as a disability. People are disabled in terms of their ability to, actively engage in maybe their work, maybe their family, maybe other parts of society because they live in poverty. And we don't really consider that like somebody who's got some medical condition that prevents them from participating in society.
Well, I would say this. I mean, and the community is much better at this, but, people are differently able. Like I saw way too many people. Who the heck was running the food bank? Who were those 700 volunteers back in the early days? A lot of people had been rejected or not accepted elsewhere. But man, I learned a lot about people still having ability, still being able to contribute. The thing we need to do is, yes, make people secure, but let's not forget about people. They can participate. It's just they're cut off. And so I think that's the other part of this conversation is let's not just sort of, if we get there, we have not got there. The disability benefit has no money attached, and it won't unless people really care hard now. It's there, and this is between now and January, very big testing ground for Canadians, and we can't miss that. Poverty makes people disabled, absolutely. But when people have a different ability, when they lose a strength in an area, does that mean they can't participate? We never want to subscribe to that because they sure as heck can't. And I remember, in fact, just before the recessions in the 90s, that there were people coming looking for single parents and people that were differently abled because they were shorthanded. And some ways that will be good as we look demographically, that people will be valued more and people will make adjustments for them. And so the places that I've been running to work, we make adjustments for people. We have a plan, and it's amazing, frankly amazing, how much you can get for people, but there are not enough places for that. So we need the income first. Then we need to not, though, let go of the fact there need to be opportunities for people because they belong in society. And frankly, the character of people who come through dealing with things, whether it's poverty, whether it's a physical, accident, or whether it's a disease, and they come out and with some encouragement and support, it's really quite not just heartening, but really an inspiration to see what people can do. But this is not, Channel 27 movie time. This is real life, and it's up to Canadians. Do they want people who have accumulated a harm? Do they want them to be solid part of society? Are we somehow going to excuse ourselves for not doing that? I believe in Canadians. I always have. I've always been rewarded with that belief. People put a stick in the ground, and people come forward. Right now, disability benefit is a stick in the ground. Can we rally around it? Can we see people with disabilities as people first, as people that have tons to contribute, and that this little bit that we can do for them, not insignificant as a policy, but something very within our reach, are we prepared to do that so they can do even more and make Canada even stronger?
Well, maybe what we'll do is we'll reconnect in 6 months and see where the character test is on that count. Gerard, thanks for joining us. It's great to have your insights and good to catch up again. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Now and Next is produced by Becky Coles. Our production manager is Jamie Nickerson. Audio editors are Mike Trutler and Drew Garner. And our sonic logo designer is Greg McDonald. Our executive producers are Dave and Aaron Trafford.
This is SSN.
Story Studio Network.